Welcome to the Achieving Your Optimal Health webinar series. And you can find our series by going to LasVegasAreaTrails.com, then clicking on Health Education. We've been going for over a year now, and you can see the wealth of titles here from our health professionals who have just brought some amazing learning, all under the area of achieving your optimal health. You click on any of these links here, and tonight we have Dr. Vicki Coleman, the anger doctor, and we click on her link, and here you see her webinar blog page. The webinar replays are present on each of these links that you saw on the previous screen. And after Dr. Vicki Coleman's webinar tonight, her webinar replay will be here so that you'll have an opportunity to look at it again. There will be things that she spoke about that you might want to dig a little deeper. She definitely has some amazing experience. I just want to give an introduction here. Over 2,300 years ago, the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle said, anyone can become angry, that's easy. But to be angry with the right person, to the right degree, at the right time, for the right purpose, in the right way, that's not easy. So there are different kinds of anger, and there's appropriate anger and inappropriate destructive anger. And Dr. Vicki Coleman is going to help us to understand the difference between these. There are few emotions more destructive than uncontrolled anger. A moment of anger can undo years of thoughtful work in creating relationships, friendships, and careers. And I'm sure that everyone here has seen how anger has destroyed a lot of positive nurturing that has occurred, things that have been built up very carefully over years, and then all of a sudden a moment of anger can destroy that. Fortunately, there are approaches to understanding and managing our anger and even channeling it into more positive behavior. In today's webinar, Dr. Vicki Coleman will guide us in understanding and managing our anger. And so let's hold Dr. Vicki Coleman to this. She's promising that in this webinar, we're going to learn the definition of anger and anger management, global and historical changes that affect anger, how to identify the antecedents and triggers related to anger, biological, psychological, cultural, and environmental issues related to anger, strategies and techniques for addressing anger and anger management. So there's a whole, there's a whole atmosphere around us that has to do with culture and history and our own biological and psychological makeup, and Dr. Vicki is going to help us understand how that affects our anger and management of anger. And the benefits of attending this webinar, you're going to understand that anger is a valid emotion, understand global implications of anger, and identify strategies and techniques for managing anger. And Dr. Coleman, she's got so many letters after her name that I don't know what a lot of these stand for, but I am impressed.
Sometimes I forget what they stand for.
That's so good though. But each one represents some credential that I'm sure you worked for and that has added to your knowledge and your effectiveness in anger management. So Dr. Vicki Coleman is an anger management expert, internationally recognized behavioral health specialist, clinical psychotherapist, and online professor of psychology counseling human services, and history. She's also president and CEO of the Anger Doctor and the Coleman Group. So we're really fortunate to have her here. A former tenured professor at Purdue University in West Lafayette, Indiana, Dr. Coleman has also held positions in mental health, social services, criminal justice, food and beverage, and transportation, including Northwestern University Educational Testing Service and American Airlines. She conducts research on anger management, career development, vocational psychology, sports counseling, addictions, military families, and multicultural and diverse populations. Dr. Coleman has several international referred publications in these areas. So she has some books that we might want to take a look at. I'm not going to read all of this, but I'd just like to say, yeah, definitely, take a look at Dr. Coleman's credentials. She has focused her career to a large part on anger management. It's definitely, there's a lot more to it than anger management, but she is a true specialist in that area. We are very fortunate to have her with us tonight. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing the screen, and Vicki, do you know how to share the screen?
Yes, I do. I will do that right now.
Okay. It's good to see Michelle here.
Yes. Hi, Michelle. How are
Hi,
you
hi, Dr.
today?
Vicki.
Hi. Thanks for coming. And
Yes, of course.
Michelle, I think you will have even a better understanding because much of this I presented, a couple of weeks ago at our Summerlin referral
Yes, is this
meeting.
the expanded version?
Yes, so
Okay,
you have
great.
a little more time, don't have to rush
Mm-hmm.
as much. And I want to thank Rosemary and Annie. I have not met you previously, but I'm looking forward to working with you. So, are there any questions before we begin? And I'd like to thank all of you and David for that great introduction. Uh, we will talk about a theoretical framework, strategies and techniques, and research. Now, Michelle, you know the answer to the exam. My primary career environment is academia. So, of course, I must give an examination before we begin, not after, before we begin. So, everyone, Michelle, please don't give the answer because you know.
Okay.
So, for the rest of you, what was the major international event that occurred in November of 1989 that changed the entire world? And I will give you a clue. It did not occur in the United States. And what's interesting about this event,
Annie just put something in the chat.
oh,
And Annie wrote in chat, Berlin Wall.
absolutely. Thank you, Annie. You get the prize, a consultation with me. Yes. And any of you can have a consultation with me. But yes, that was the major event that changed the world because prior to November 1989, it was sort of a us and them, us meaning the United States and some of Western Europe and maybe South America, but it was us versus the communists. The communists are coming. And so we grew up in that environment. And if you think about it, a lot of fear was instilled in us from children to adolescence and adulthood. Now, I would briefly like to discuss some of the changes in the global village. And that's what the term has now been the global village because it's not an us versus them. It's a global village, a global economy. So, of course, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the first change was in governments and political systems. So, primarily that Eastern European bloc of communism was, and the Soviet Union were shut down. And so people were allowed to move around in terms of demographics. A lot of people migrated and immigrated to other countries. Many came to the United States. And so we really are much more diverse in 2020 than we had been in 1989. The economy became a global economy. Prior to 1989, it was the US economy versus the world economy. But now it is a global economy. So what happens in any country, it could be what happens in Venezuela, or what happens in, of course, China, or any of the other Asian countries, and certainly even places like Ukraine. These all affect the global economy. Now, my favorite change is technology, because if you think prior to 1989, of course, there were PCs and Macs, and some people say 1989 was the beginning of the internet. Actually, there was an OperaNet. Many times we don't realize that what we use today was developed years and years ago, because these systems were used in the military. And about the late 1980s or into the 1990s, these were rolled out for the masses. And so technology is my most favorite, because around this time, the internet became available to the masses. And look where we are today. Relationships, all types of relationships began to change. Of course, relationships with governments and political systems, relationships with individuals, families, relationships with the economy. Our values, mores, core beliefs, and worldview were challenged, and still are today, because we are primarily engaging with people from different backgrounds. And this is very exciting, but this is what I consider the source, partly the source of conflict, when values and mores and core beliefs and the worldview of individuals and groups and systems collide and create conflict. Now, we all know that conflict can be great. Conflict, I believe, facilitates change. However, let's look at what's happening today. Today, there is a lot of conflict based on inappropriate behavior. And what I don't like about today's conflict, it's obvious that many in law enforcement and others have committed heinous acts. However, I don't think it's an appropriate response to assault others and burn down buildings and destroy property. To me, that is not the way to handle the conflict. Our environment, we talk about global warming. Some people say there's no such thing, but I think for the masses, for myself, probably for you, there are significant changes in the weather. And look at Las Vegas. We're at what, 10, 15 degrees cooler than the last 2 summers. So even at that level, and of course, I think our environment has become more polluted, primarily because of some of the practices that we have adhered to in the past and in the present. Safety, prior to 1989, as I indicated, it was us, the Democrats, versus the communists. And now there are still some communist countries, China, Hong Kong, Cuba, a few other pockets of the world. But now there was a new type of terrorism. I did a little research on terrorism, and many terrorist acts or communities were a result of poverty and injustice and being mistreated. However, what in my research, what was interesting about terrorism is that the terrorists are very, very intelligent. They have access to technology. They're very good with technology, and they have a lot of money. And so they are able to spread throughout the world and have cells, what are called cells, throughout every country. And so it's not just the terrorist in another country. We all know about terrorists here in the United States. Remember the Murrah Federal Building? And I think it was, well, actually, we just passed a couple of anniversaries for many terrorist acts in the United States, the Murrah Federal Building, some of these other cult-like terrorists. The names don't come to me right away, but they will. One of my favorite changes in addition to technology is the world of work. And look at us today with respect to COVID-19. Now, no one had anticipated this, and there had been many changes. Many companies and many entrepreneurs were working at home, but no one ever anticipated that we would be forced to stay home for 2.5, 3 months. And so now I read recently that many companies, they did not anticipate that most of their workers would be very productive. And so what's happened now is they're considering that maybe they won't bring everyone back to work in the traditional work environment to the office building. They may allow all or most of or some of their workers to work at home. So, and I think in terms of other changes, just at a more micro level, changes in our thinking, changes in our behavior, changes in our perspectives, being exposed to different perspectives because of that initial major international event in 1989. Now, are there any questions or comments? I'm not a lecturer. I like to engage the audience. So if you have questions, just jump in. You don't have to wait until the end. But let me ask you this. Have any of you identified or discerned any changes that I did not cover? Or any changes personally that you would like to share with the group?
I think in 2020, there's been so many changes. It's almost, it feels like there's been as many changes in the last 6 months as there have in your whole list. It's like it's a whole different world. But what I'm wondering is, are you setting the tone here to say that in an environment of change, that this elicits anger? Does this feed into anger?
Yes, that is it. Those are great comments and a great question, David. Yes, absolutely. That's exactly what I'm doing. I'm setting the foundation or the tone, as you say, because what has happened for me when I talk about anger, and I'll talk more about anger in a few moments in terms of a definition. However, the challenge and the problem, as I see it, is that we are not taught how to respond to conflict.
Mm.
There now, anger management is a more recent phenomenon. You quoted Aristotle, the philosopher, who talked about anger and anger management. However, what challenges me and what is very disturbing to me is that in our educational institutions, at the elementary, secondary, post-secondary levels, in other institutions, religious institutions, professional and learned and trade institutions, we are really not taught how to respond to anger. And in a few moments, I'll talk about the antecedents and the triggers of that. So that you're absolutely right. I'm laying the foundation such that it's more complex than we think. When people come to me for help, they just want to rush through a class and say, okay. And oftentimes I provide a lot of mandated anger management training and counseling. However, we need to slow it down and look at ourselves initially. So that's a very good, and you'll get some more information about this in a few moments, but that's
It
great
was
comments and question.
it was surprising to me when I heard that because of the stay-at-home situation that domestic violence had gone up.
Yes, I
So,
was going to mention that because one of my areas of expertise is domestic violence. And Nevada is in the top 5 in the country, maybe
uh,
possibly number 1 for domestic violence. And the numbers spiked, have spiked during the COVID stay at home order. So that is very, very frustrating. But the antecedents of that, David and Rosemary and Annie and Michelle, the antecedents are that we did not learn how to deal with conflict. Now, we did, I'm going to say that again. We did not learn how to deal with conflict, but we did learn how to deal with conflict. We learned how to respond inappropriately to conflict based on our primary system that's growing up in our family system. And in many families, now this is not 100%, but I would say 80%, most families have some type of dysfunction. And what we learned how our parents, how other family members, how our peer group, how our educational institutions, how our government respond to conflict, and how excuse me, and how did some of these entities respond to conflict? By yelling, screaming, fighting, name calling, all the way up the rungs of the ladder to physical assault and violence and sometimes murder. So what happened, we learned that as a child, and then we moved to adolescence and adulthood, and without any major intervention, we become adults. And so when there's a conflict, when there's a disagreement, how do we respond? The same way our parents responded, because those were the models that we were exposed to. And so it's unfortunate. At some level, there's got to be an intervention. And of course, it's not too late for us as adults, but it really should begin with the family system.
and
And
if you watch the Twitter feed, you can see how the leaders of our nation are still there.
yes, that's right. Responding like children. I mean, it
Yes.
amazes how adults get into these fights. And it
Yep.
reminds me of kids in the sand lot, the playground. They're
Mhm.
fighting over their toys, or they're fighting over leadership positions. And so catapult that into adulthood. It's the same behavior. It's just that as adults, we have access to more
Mhm.
weapons, literally more weapons. And so it's just getting to be very, very ugly. But thanks for uh, initiating this discussion with your comments and questions. Any other questions or comments before we move on? All right. Okay. So let's look at the elements of culture. This is some work that a couple of colleagues and I did several years ago in 1989, 1990, based on some work by some other and colleagues, Shine and some other sociologists and psychologists. And what we did, we took it and refined it a little bit. And this will help us better understand who we are and better understand how to deal with conflict. So let me just say that culture, first of all, is not just a function of ethnicity or racial identity. In fact, we deliberately did not include ethnicity or racial identity because no matter, not that that's not important, of course that's important, but within each culture, these elements occur. So it doesn't matter your ethnic background, your racial identity. Doesn't matter if we live in Las Vegas or San Diego or Miami or New York or Poughkeepsie or Pocatello, Idaho. These are the elements of every culture. And every culture, every major cultural group has a subculture. And each of us, consider this, please, each of us is part of several cultures. For example, we're into optimal health. That's a culture. But then our particular occupation is a culture. We may live in a certain part of Las Vegas or somewhere else. That is a culture. So we can be a member of 10, 5, 10, 15, 20 cultures on any given day, and we can move in and out of the different cultures. And of course, most of us have friends, family, colleagues, neighbors from different cultural backgrounds. So the sense of self, I think this is the most important. And this addresses one of my areas of expertise and interest, and that would refer to self-concept development and self-esteem. And we can talk about that later. Uh, Communication and language. It's not just the language spoken, but nonverbal communication. And then, of course, in the United States, the primary language is English. Some would say English and Spanish or other languages. However, within each language that is spoken, there are different dialects. For example, I am from the Midwest, from Michigan. So when we speak of a soft drink, we call a soft drink pop. We don't say Coke, or we say, well, a soft drink. We say pop. And in some southern parts of the country, every soft drink is a Coke, even if it's a 7 Up. And I'm not sure. I've lived in Utah, Nevada, and California. I don't really know what it's called here. I think it's soft drink here. But because we're so multicultural, when I'm out eating or at a store, I hear people say soft drink or Coke or pop, and they're referencing different flavors. So it's interesting that as we move around the country, sometimes we're speaking the exact same language, but a different dialect. All right, dress and appearance. This is one of my most frustrating and challenging because from being from the Midwest, I tend to be a little more formal and conservative. And everything now is so relaxed. I visited Vegas probably 20, 25, 30 times before I moved here. And when I would first visit Vegas in the 80s and 90s, people, for example, would dress up when they went to shows. And now people go to the show with jeans, holes in their jeans, which is interesting because when I grew up, you wouldn't have holes in your jeans. Now you pay $100 for holes in the jeans. It's like, I'm not going to pay $100 for some jeans that already have holes in them. But that's just a fun example that I use. But dress is very relaxed. Remember, it used to be casual Friday. Now it's casual any day. And of course, if we telework, we can work in our jammies or whatever we work in. Values and mores. These are the things that are important to us and our particular behaviors. So what are your values? I think each of us at this webinar would value education. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. But values and mores are important because depending on the cultural interest or background, they could be incongruent. They could clash, which could lead to conflict. And of course, beliefs and attitudes. One belief and attitude that recently changed that was a very prominent belief and attitude and political statement was when, for example, the NFL said no kneeling during the national anthem. And of course, a couple of weeks ago, Roger Goodell, the NFL commissioner, did a 180. He reversed that. So you see, it's interesting what precipitates the change of one's belief and attitudes. And one thing he said was that, and everyone knew this, I didn't know it was quite that high, but 70% of the NFL players are Black. So I think that's significant. Time and space. I'm moving too fast. Time and space, that references our relationship with the universe and space and time. And of course, it seems that when we're younger, kids and adolescents, doesn't it seem that time moves so slowly? And then everybody wants to be 13, 16, 18, 21, 25. And after that, it's like, it's all a blur. It's like time goes by so quickly. So, but our relationship with the universe. Food and feeding habits. This is one of my favorite because I love food. I'm a foodie. But more importantly, the role of food in our culture, in our society. And food can be used to manipulate and shape behavior. For example, oftentimes people will say, we're going to have a meeting at 7 p.m. on a Friday night. Now, who wants to go to a meeting on Friday night at 7 p.m.? Mandatory meeting. However, if you say it's going to be a gourmet buffet dinner, then kind of changes our mind a little bit. And of course, in Las Vegas, food is very prominent in terms of manipulating and shaping behavior. Food is very celebratory. And in some cultural groups, if you go to their home, you must eat something. You cannot leave. I remember one Thanksgiving, I went to 3 full-fledged dinners because I had to because of family, and I will never ever do that again. And it was and none of the I could never tell any of the others that I had been to Thanksgiving dinner. It was such a horrible feeling. I wanted to die. You know how you bargain with the Lord, Lord, let me live through this and I will never ever do it again. And I haven't but anyway, food is a very important part of many cultures. Family and relationships, I alluded to this earlier in terms of the global village, the changes with respect to for example, the nuclear family of the 50s and 60s and into the 70s, that is a very small percentage of our families. We have, the families are multicultural. The families can be what we define the families to be. Play and leisure. Now, weren't we sold a bill of goods when they said, oh, with all this technology, we're going to have more free time? Didn't we hear that? Now we have to manage the technology. Most people have 2 smartphones. They have a personal computer or a Mac, or they have email and all these different technological, they call devices that we have to then manage. So I'm not sure, and it has facilitated what we do in communication. We're on Zoom right now. However, I coined a term, Zoom traumatic stress disorder, ZTSD, knowledge and learning. There are different learning styles, such as, are you auditory? Are you visual? Are you kinesthetic, that or tactile? That would be the feeling. Now, this is critical because everyone does not subscribe to the same learning style. So, for example, in your business, if you work with others, and in any business, we're going to work with others, if you're working on a project and your colleague or colleagues have a different learning style, that could be a challenge for you with respect to completing the project. Work and work habits. In the United States, maybe up to 1989, maybe a little before or later, the primary work ethic, we were taught the Judeo-Christian work ethic. Now we know in 2020, that is not the only work ethic, very similar to knowledge and learning. So you have your work ethic, I have my work ethic. We're doing a good job, but maybe our work ethics are incongruent. For example, some of the casinos and other, not just casinos, have had trouble with hiring people, say, from South America because, for example, I worked with one manager who hired a person from South America, and great person, said, we're going to report to work tomorrow morning. So the person showed up about 10:30. And of course, initially, the manager was concerned. You're supposed to be here at 8:30. Well, but in my culture, it's 10:30. So you can see the difference and how conflict. We have to look at people's work and work ethic and the habits that they subscribe to. And then finally, spirituality. We deliberately did not include religion. Religion is different. Spirituality, I believe, addresses the meaning of life. Why are we here? The raison d'etre. What does all of this mean? Okay, any questions or comments before we move on? Okay, let's see. Theoretical framework. I'm not going to go into all these theories, but each of the theories, Donald Super, this is the primary individual that I subscribe to. He focuses on self-concept development. And it's interesting when you look at theorists, they parlay their theory based on someone else's theory. So Donald Super talked about self-concept development and life stages. His theoretical framework was an outgrowth of Robert Havikhurst, who talked about developmental tasks. And if you see how they overlap, Harry Stack Sullivan talked about the self as a system and developmental epochs or tasks. Dr. Albert Ellis, and by the way, I got a chance to meet Donald Super and Albert Ellis. And Albert Ellis talks about rational emotive behavior therapy. And he was a very direct approach to therapy where he talks about irrational beliefs. I took some of his training. By the way, my major advisor at Rutgers was a student of Donald Super. And then the only one alive is Dr. Stanton Samanow, the others were psychologists. Dr. Stanton Samanow is a psychiatrist, and his premier work primarily he works with criminals. However, his theory crosses all backgrounds. And what I appreciate about him is he talks about errors in thinking, the thinking errors. For example, we are taught thinking errors in that men should do this, women should do that, psychologists should do this, entrepreneurs should do this, criminals should do. We've been socialized and brainwashed to subscribe to shoulds, and all of these people would say these are thinking errors or conflict with respect to cognitive behavior. All right, I'm not going to. Okay, all right. So those are the 5 theorists that I subscribe to: Super, Havikhurst, Stack Sullivan, Ellis, and Samanow. All right, now definition of anger. We must remember it's a valid emotion. Do not allow someone to tell you, oh, David, you shouldn't be angry. Or Michelle, why are you angry? We have a right to be angry. And if we are angry, and that is okay. So don't allow someone to say, well, you shouldn't be angry. That's not a big deal. And don't people say that to us all the time? And I want to slap them. No, I'm just kidding. I'm not a violent person. My point is, do not allow someone to tell you should not be angry. The challenge is not the anger. The challenge is how we respond to the anger. Many of us, probably all of us, are angry because of some injustice, being wronged, disrespected, being treated unfairly. That is why are angry, and that is okay. The key is, what do we do about it? So please keep in mind that anger is a valid emotion. I'm not used to, usually when I do PowerPoint, I have someone else changing the slides for me. Okay, anger management. This is the Aristotle quote that David read before we began. Anyone can become angry. And as you see the dates, this is not something new. People thought in the 90s, anger and anger management was some nouveau riche type of platform or behavior or emotion. That is easy, but to be angry with the right person, to the right degree, at the right time, for the right purpose, and in the right way, that is not easy. So essentially, Aristotle was talking about anger and anger management. All right. Now, the causes of anger. And I think that whenever we're angry, it's a combination. It's not just one, but it's a combination. So it's going to be biological, psychosocial, cultural, and environmental. Biological, that would be, for example, how is our biological, physiological, and genetic, how is our body responding? So one of the first things I ask my clients and patients to do, well, the question I ask is, when was your last comprehensive physical examination? Because we want, and I think Michelle in particular would appreciate this, and the rest of you also, but we want to rule out any biological, physiological, or genetic challenges because that can cause anger. That could be one of the antecedents. And of course, the psychological or mental disorder cause of anger. If one is suffering from depression, obviously they're unhappy. So certainly that might be one of the antecedents of a person becoming angry. Or sociological. Look what's happening in our society. I think we're all angry at some level, no matter what side you're on. I would hope we would all be on the side of justice, but some people aren't. But that's a sociological and environmental issue. And then, of course, cultural. Some cultures dictate how we are supposed to respond with respect to anger, conflict, and other emotions. So I believe what I'm saying in terms of the causes, if someone comes to me presenting as being angry, say mandated anger management, as I said, the first question I ask is your last physical examination, because we want to rule out any physical illness or disease. Of course, if someone is in pain all the time, he or she is probably going to be angry, and that's okay. But how do we get around that? And maybe I in particular need to work with his or her physician, primary care physician, or psychiatrist. I'm a psychologist, but I might need to work as a team to help this individual understand his or her anger. Okay, I'm going to just kind of move a little bit quicker. Now, the bully. Okay, the bully. We have all heard this term. The bully has low self-esteem, poor communication skills, impaired relations. The challenge is that everyone, and some may not agree with my next statement or current present statement, everyone has been bullied. However, everyone has been the bully at least once. And we may be in denial. We may not want to admit it. And there are different levels of bullyism, but we've all been the bully. But more importantly, we all have been bullied. But the bully is a response to low self-esteem, poor communication skills, impaired relationships. Okay. As I said, we've all been a bully. We've all been bullied. And the problem in terms of breaking the cycle, most bullies are also victims. And you could be a bully and a victim. One could be bullied at work, for example, and then we go home and bully our spouse or kick the dog or our kids or other family members, friends, relationships. So, and I coined the term the accidental bully. And the reason I say accidental bully, nobody chooses to be a bully. So it is an accident, but it's an accident based on a compilation of complex systems and behavior. Okay, someone who suffers from one or more self-esteem deficits attempts to compensate at the expense of other individuals. This is one of my PhD students at Purdue. Okay, the bully. Now, it's interesting because a lot of the literature talks about the bully at the elementary and secondary levels, as if adults are actually the worst bullies. We are the worst bullies more so than, say, adolescents or young children. And in every workplace, there is a bully. Sometimes the bully is the manager. Sometimes the bully is the janitor. It doesn't matter. And of course, with technology, what has intrigued me is cyberbullying. I've been bullied on Facebook where I had to contact Facebook and they handled it very well. I was about to take a restraining order out on this woman who, now this is interesting. I had a client in Spain for domestic violence, and she was trying to reconcile with her boyfriend. And her mother and family didn't like the boyfriend, but she made a mistake and told her mother about me. And her mother just started writing. Now, Her mother had no right to write a review about me because she was not my client or patient. But she started calling law firms. I have 6 licenses in 5 states. So I work out of Los Angeles, Las Vegas, Chicago, Detroit, and Indianapolis, the whole state of Indiana, those states, cities and states. She started calling attorneys in all these states. She started posting these nasty things on Facebook. And so I had to step up and I said, look, if you continue this behavior, I'm going to contact the FBI. And then I did write Facebook, and Facebook removed the reviews. I blocked her. I blocked everyone with her last name, which probably some people I shouldn't have blocked. But my point is, it's inevitable at some point you will be cyberbullied, but take care of it because there are systems. And of course, it's against the law. So is it bullying or harassment? I think they're the same. I think they're the same. Okay, this is anger assessment. This is an instrument that I developed, and I use it with all of my clients, be they individual, family, group, organizational institution. And I look at the past, the present, and the future, focusing on themes, trends, and patterns of behavior. This was published in 1998. And these are the primary tool that I use. Remember, I talked about self-concept development. The primary tool I use is the Tennessee Self-Concept Scale. So it's their model, the Fitz and Warren model, that I use when I look at self-concept. Because when people talk about self-concept, they think it's one entity. No, it's not. I consider self-concept 6 entities: the personal self-concept, physical self-concept, family self-concept, social, community self-concept, academic work self-concept, and moral, ethical, spiritual. What's important about these 6 areas, a person comes to me and says, oh, I have low self-esteem or self-concept. I believe that individual, but no one is low self-concept in all 6 areas. Otherwise, they would be institutionalized. So I help that individual in my assessment look at which area they're lower and where they need intervention. And what's important about this, when I talked about the antecedents of self-concept and the antecedents of anger, I want to go back to that person's childhood and initial family system to determine how they responded to conflict. Okay, this is another assessment tool that I use on occasion where they talk about assertion, empathy, stress, aggression. All of these behaviors are part of anger, can be manifested in anger. Right. And this is another one: truthfulness, anger, of course, substance, alcohol, drugs, other addictions. For example, we're in Las Vegas. So what's 3 primary addictions: alcohol, drugs, and gambling. And I've worked with many people who have one or all 3. And that presents a challenge because when alcohol, and I don't have to go into the details of the implications of alcohol and drugs and gambling or any addictions because we understand. Okay, these are some strategies and techniques. First of all, the comprehensive assessment, where I ask about last comprehensive physical exam. Then I look at the individual. Every strategy is individualized to the person because I want to determine the person's skills and then develop a program specifically for that person. But we have to look at communication. So how does one make decision making? What intrigues me and disturbs me is that in our educational institutions, they don't teach decision making, they don't teach anger management, they don't teach stress management, and emotional intelligence is just how do we function? How do we manage ourselves? See. Other strategies and techniques: individual and organizational consultation, anger management training, problem solving, collaboration, group facilitation, and violence in the workplace training. That's real important. Let's see. Sexual harassment, negotiation. I'm a federal mediator, a divorce and family mediator. And then, of course, It's always important. In terms of my research, I like to do a pre and post test, assess the individual when they come to me, and then assess them after they've completed my specific training or model. Now, there are alternative strategies. Animal assisted therapy is very, very popular now. And I've had clients where I wrote ESA letters, emotional support animal letters, say for them to take their dog on the airline, or in fact, there's a miniature horse. I think his name is Flirty. He flies on American Airlines with his owner periodically. Horses are very popular. Equine therapy refers to horses. And then dolphins. These are all any type of strategy, creative arts that will help a person better understand himself or herself. Uh, those are the three profiles that I use. Questions and answers, because we're running out of time. You can see this could be a class that I would teach, or certainly the program that I would use when I work with my clients. So questions, comments, observations.
Well, you definitely gave us the summary of a whole educational curriculum there.
Yeah, I think what I want to do next, and I would like the support from this group, is take some of the components and do a webinar on some of the components of this, because certainly, particularly on the antecedents and the triggers, that could be a separate webinar, a separate webinar on self-concept and self-esteem, and a webinar on the bully. As I said, almost each slide could almost be a webinar in and of itself.
I think one thing that you did is you showed us that anger is not just a simple spontaneous event, but it has a whole network of relationships and your makeup, your culture, all of that, and it arises from that, and so it's complex, and
Very
and I
complex.
guess one thing that I get from this is, let's take a larger look at anger,
Yeah.
and then focus. It's kind of like you're a surgeon, and a surgeon looks at the body not as, oh, this is just a human body, but looks at
Yeah.
the body as a very complex organism,
Yes.
and deals with it surgically. So
Yeah.
very good.
Thank you, David.
What would be one thing that you would suggest we do in order to make what you have said a little more practical?
I would say go back to your family system and take some notes in terms of when there was conflict in the family. How was it handled? Did your parents argue all the time? And it's not the arguing, it's the yelling and the screaming and the name calling. Were there physical assaults in your family? Did your mom hit your dad? Did your dad hit your mom? Were your siblings fighting? And I don't mean just the normal sibling roughhousing, because that's part of being a child and adolescence. But for example, I've had families that the physical fighting is so extreme that they have broken arms, broken legs, broken noses. See, that's carrying it to the extreme. So I would ask that you look initially at your family system. Complete that lifeline exercise, and that will help you look at the past, the present, and the future. And then what I want to do, David and Rosemary, is help you identify themes, trends, and patterns of behavior. Themes, trends, and patterns of behavior and thinking. Okay, when mom and dad were fighting, this is how I thought and how I felt and what I did, how I responded. And I think that's where we need to begin in terms of the initial assessment, because that's going to yield so much information about who we are. Because, see, we respond based on who we are. And as you said, it's very complex. It's not just one entity. So that's where I like to begin. And so if there's one strategy or technique or intervention, I would recommend just going back to your childhood and adolescence and see how did your family in particular respond to conflict? Because see, the challenge is that however the family responded as we entered elementary school, we've got that model, that tape playing in our head, so that if we grew up in an environment, say from birth to 5 or 6 before we started school, where the family was fighting and kicking and yelling and screaming, then when we get to school, even preschool, you can see this. How are we going to respond to conflict? The same way or similarly, because that's the model that we learned. We learned to fight, literally fight. Now there, of course.
Let me try this on you, Vicki. Okay, so there are a number of ways, obviously, of dealing with anger. One is, but I'm just going to take two of them.
Okay.
One is to recognize anger, focus on anger, try to analyze the anger in yourself, in your past, in your present, and deal with that to eliminate that anger. Now, let me ask you this question, though. If there were a positive element we could focus on that would replace the anger and make it, it just totally diffuse it, because we're not focusing on the anger, but we're focusing on a positive element that would replace it. What is that positive element that we could focus on?
Okay, that's an excellent question, and I really appreciate that. I think the positive element is that all of us have some positive, or at least one positive communication skill or strategy. So being able to say, what is a positive communication strategy that we utilize? And we all have at least one. We probably have several. So that would be like the opposite of, we got the anger, but okay, I'm angry and maybe I'm fighting. But on the other hand, I can talk to people about any type of situation. I can express how I feel to people and let them know my particular perspective. So that would be positive. So that's a great question. And hopefully that example will help you and others.
Yes, definitely. Rosemary, do you have any comments? What would you like to say?
I just loved how it was just so thorough, and that you included, the physical and the mental and the spiritual, because I really believe it's a balance. And I love how you talked about the self, and I'm all about the self as well. And so I just thoroughly enjoyed the presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
And
Rosemary. And I'm looking forward to working with you because, as I said, we complement each other. The work that we do, focusing on the self and fear and the energy. Yes, definitely. So I want to schedule a one-on-one before the end of this month, before the end of July.
Oh yeah, I would love to.
Yes, I'd love to do that. Thank you.
Wonderful.
And the contact info will be on her page, right?
Yeah, the contact. Oh, here's the. Let's see. There's the contact info right there.
Cool. I'm gonna just screenshot it. I'm on my phone.
And on the blog page, Rosemary, I've got every slide in this presentation.
Oh, awesome.
So
Thank
you
you
could
so much,
actually
David.
go to her blog page and the slide's going to be right there.
Thank you.
Sounds good.
Yes.
Okay. Well, marvelous. Thank you so much, Vicki.
And thank you and the rest of the audience.
Thank you.
Rosemary, Annie, and Michelle. Yes.
Yeah. Annie texted me. She had company at her house, so she had to hop off.
Yeah. What I like about this your program, David, is that they can replay. In fact, I'll listen to the replay myself. So that's an opportunity for, everybody will have an opportunity to hear the presentation, because of course we can't always be live at an event. So.
Well, thank you. And Vicki, we're so honored to have had you in this presentation, and you've raised a whole lot of issues, put a lot on the radar that was definitely not on my radar.
That's good. I'm so glad I could do that
Yeah,
for you,
yeah.
the
Mhm.
audience. Yes.
Okay. Well, that concludes our webinar for this evening. And thank you again, Vicki and Rosemary, for being here and being a part of this. I'm looking forward to the two of you connecting
Yes,
and
definitely.
some really positive things that
Mhm.
can happen as a result of that.
I think so. Thank you
Yes,
so
me
much.
too.
And
Thank you.
thank
Okay,
you, and have
thank
a
you.
great evening.